On my birthday, the silence in the house became so heavy that I finally texted my family just a small reminder that I was still here. Minutes later, my daughter replied, "We need space. Please stop contacting us." My son-in-law even liked that message, so I gave them exactly what they asked for. I blocked every contact and quietly closed the door to the comfortable life they'd always relied on. Within 24 hours, that space had turned into 147 missed calls and 89 panicked begging messages. But it was too late. The real show was just beginning. Thank you for being here with me. Before the story continues, please leave a comment and tell me, what are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, or winding down? I read your thoughts more than you think. Note: some details are adjusted for storytelling and reflection. The heart of the story, the message, is what I hope stays with you. On my 71st birthday, the silence in my house was so heavy I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting down the seconds of a life that felt suddenly jarringly hollow. Thane Garrison, age 70, retired founder of a national hardware empire, sat in my Oregon study, overlooking a dormant lavender garden. The mist was rolling in off the Willamette River, obscuring the rows of plants my late wife Catherine had tended with such devotion. I spent 40 years building Garrison architectural hardware into a $48 million empire, thinking I was securing a future for my family. Now that empire felt like a fortress, built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep me in. Silence is an achievement, Catherine used to say, but tonight it feels like a sentence. I looked down at the desk. Despite my wealth, I was currently eating a cold turkey sandwich on a paper plate, having dismissed my entire household staff for the day just to see if my daughter would show up for a birthday dinner she had promised weeks ago. The dining room table was set for three, the silver, polished and the crystal gleaming, but the chairs remained tucked in, vacant and accusing. The only scent in the room was the faint, lingering smell of lemon oil and the dry, metallic tang of the cold meat. Do you know what $48 million smells like? It smells like lavender and old paper, but it tastes like dust when there is no one to share it with. I have lived my life by the ledger, and tonight the balance was deeply in the red. I opened the top drawer of my mahogany desk and pulled out the file containing the summary of my daughter Victoria's financial life. For 3 years I have not been a father. I have been a faceless ATM. I looked at the line items, the $45,000 monthly allowance, the down payment for that glass-walled Seattle penthouse, and the endless stream of bailouts for her husband Brendan's failing tech ventures. I gave her a life of luxury to honor your memory, Catherine, but I think I only taught her how to spend it. I remembered her final warning, whispered through the haze of morphine, about the dangers of enabling a spirit that refuses to work. I had been blinded by grief, trying to buy back the love I lost when Catherine died. My thumb hovered over the power button of my phone. Dark, still dark. Not even a happy birthday from the woman I had spent $2 million on this year alone. The glass of the screen felt cold against my skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the desk lamp. I reached for the phone again, my pulse steady despite the impending dread. I realized that the draft I had prepared weeks ago to freeze the trust accounts was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a necessity. I had to decide if I would delete the file or execute the order that would strip the gold leaf off my daughter's artificial world. The clock struck 8, and as the last chime echoed, I made a choice that would either save my daughter or destroy our family forever. I touched the screen, the blue light illuminating the deep lines of my face as I began to type. The glass of the smartphone felt unnaturally cold against my thumb, a digital gateway to a daughter who felt more like a stranger with every passing year. My birthday evening was slipping into the dark, and that glowing rectangle was the only thing connecting me to the world I had built for Victoria. The impending dread I had felt all day was no longer just a premonition. Earlier that afternoon, a high-priority security alert from my private banker had flashed across my desktop. Victoria had attempted to move beyond her $45,000 monthly allowance, trying to access the primary principal account of the Hayes Family Trust. It was a bold, desperate reach into the heart of the capital Catherine and I had spent decades accumulating. I stared at the blinking cursor in the empty message field, my hand trembling slightly as the gravity of her betrayal settled in my chest. My mind raced through a dozen different versions of a text. I considered asking how her week was going in Seattle, or if Brendan's latest tech startup had finally moved past the burning cash phase. but every draft felt hollow. Is "hope you are well" too formal? Is "I miss you" too weak? At 70, I found it absurd that I had to carefully curate a single sentence for my own child, as if I were negotiating a hostile takeover rather than reaching out to my flesh and blood. The weight of 7 decades pressed down on my shoulders, making the silence of the study feel even more oppressive. Trying to connect with Victoria these days was like shouting into a well and hearing only the splash of my own money hitting the bottom. I realized that the luxury I had provided had become a wall between us, thick and impenetrable. I deleted a long, rambling paragraph about my day and replaced it with simplicity over strategy. I typed out 4 words: "I love you, sweetheart." It was a phrase that used to be a given when she was a little girl running through the lavender garden, but now it felt like a high-stakes gamble with a very low probability of return. I remembered the last time I actually heard her voice. It was a 3-minute call where she didn't ask how I was doing after my recent checkup. She only wanted to know if I would cover an unexpected designer furniture expense for their new terrace. I stared at the send button. It looked like a detonator. In a way, I suppose it was. If she replied with kindness, perhaps the freeze on the accounts could wait. If she ignored me, the draft for the bank would be executed by morning. I took a deep breath, the scent of the lemon-oiled mahogany filling my lungs, and pressed the send button. The digital whoosh sound echoed in the silent room, sounding remarkably like a final exhaled breath. Just as the message status flipped to send a social media notification popped up on the top of the screen. It was a tagged photo from a gala in Seattle. There was Victoria dressed in emerald silk, and Brendan laughing as they held crystal flutes of champagne. They weren't too busy to remember a birthday, they were just too indifferent to care. They looked radiant, untouched by the cold mist currently swallowing my estate. The message status flipped to "delivered" at exactly 8:20 p.m. For the next 5 minutes, the 3 dots of a typing indicator danced on my screen, mocking my heartbeat as I waited for the verdict. The silence of the room was punctured by the sharp, metallic vibration of my phone against the mahogany desk, a sound that felt like a gavel striking a death sentence. I watched the bubbles on the screen finally solidify into words. Those 3 dancing dots I had watched for 5 agonizing minutes were not Victoria, struggling with a sentimental birthday greeting. I glanced at my tablet, which sat nearby, still logged into the family's old shared social media dashboard. A notification there betrayed the truth: Victoria's account was being accessed from a different IP address in the same house. It was Brendan Hayes, my 32-year-old son-in-law and a serial failed entrepreneur, who was actually drafting the response. He was a man who had made a career out of spending my capital while treating me like a burdensome relic. The message finally landed with a clinical coldness that made the air in the study feel like ice. "We need distance," the text read. "Your constant checking in is suffocating. Please respect our boundaries." Beneath the blue bubble, a small heart icon appeared. Brendan had liked his own handiwork on her phone. The realization that they were huddled together in their emerald silk world, united in their disdain for me on my 70th birthday, hit me with the physical force of a heavy blow to the solar plexus. I sat back in the leather chair, the scent of Catherine's roses outside the window suddenly feeling like funeral flowers. Have you ever looked at a person you raised and realized you were looking at a stranger you built out of your own mistakes? I began scrolling back through our message history. My own words were a trail of 11 heartfelt outreaches over the last month, questions about her life and invitations to visit. Her replies were exactly 2. Both were transactional, confirming receipts of wire transfers. I thought of the $45,000 I had moved into her account just last week for a wellness retreat in Sedona. She hadn't even mentioned it. I was a bridge they only crossed when they wanted to get to the other side's gold. A cold surgical resolve began to knit together where my grief had once been. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hall, its rhythmic ticking no longer a countdown but a metronome for a new plan. I understood now that respect wasn't something I could buy with monthly stipends or penthouse down payments. It was something I had to enforce by removing the reward for their bad behavior. Click, click. 2 names, 2 blocks. The digital world went silent, and for the first time in years, I breathed a clean, sharp breath. The phone felt heavy in my hand, a piece of useless plastic. I didn't just stop their messages. I knew that by severing this digital link, I was activating a silent kill switch I had written into the trust documents months ago. Those amendments required a monthly biometric and digital check-in to keep the automated disbursements active. By blocking them, I had effectively locked the vault door and melted the key. They wanted distance, and I was about to give them exactly what they asked for, along with the cold, hard vacuum of a life without my money to fill the space. I cast the phone aside into the darkness of the study, listening to it thud against the carpet. The time for being an ATM was over. It was time to be the architect again. The dial tone was the most honest thing I had heard all night, a steady, unblinking frequency that did not ask for a wire transfer or demand space. I sat in the darkened study of my Thorn estate, the cold plastic of the receiver pressed against my ear. My pulse was a slow, rhythmic drum, devoid of the frantic heat that usually accompanies a family crisis. I had spent 70 years learning that heat is for the reckless, cold is for the builders. The kill switch I had activated moments earlier was not a sudden whim of rage. It was a failsafe that Margaret Fletcher and I had debated adding years ago when Catherine's health first began to fail. It was a manual voice authorization protocol that required me to verbally confirm my identity during a final login attempt to release major trust assets. By refusing to speak when the prompt appeared, I had effectively frozen the Garrison legacy in place. Margaret Fletcher, 63, had been my attorney and closest confidant since we both lived in a two-bedroom walk-up in Seattle, and when she finally picked up on the fourth ring, her voice was thick with sleep. "Richard, it is nearly 9 on your birthday. What did Victoria do this time, Margaret?" I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "It is done. The bridge is gone. I need to move the trust, all of it." I told her about the suffocating text and the mockery of that red heart emoji sent from a house where my son-in-law was playing games with my life. Margaret didn't offer empty platitudes or lawyerly stalls. She heard the absolute certainty in my tone. "Meet me at Pioneer Tower in 30 minutes, she replied. "I will have the night security clear a path. Portland at night looks like a circuit board, and tonight I was the current coming to blow a fuse Victoria never even knew existed. I steered my classic sedan through the rain-slick streets, the wipers slapping a steady rhythm against the windshield. I passed the flagship showroom of Garrison Architectural Hardware, the polished brass logos gleaming under the streetlights, and I felt nothing but a hollow sense of duty. I was driving past the monuments of my own success to protect the memory of a woman who understood the value of a day's work. Catherine believed effort was the only currency that mattered, and it was high time Victoria learned to earn her own way. Speed, 65, 70. The rain didn't care about my birthday, and neither did the laws of gravity. Everything was falling into place, or perhaps just falling away. I watched the glowing needle of Pioneer Tower grow larger against the misty Oregon sky. I was mentally drafting the bylaws for the Catherine Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, envisioning a future where my money went to hands that actually knew how to build something. As I pulled into the underground garage and made my way to the lobby, the atmosphere shifted. Standing near the polished granite desk was a private security guard I didn't recognize. He wasn't one of Margaret's usual firm hires. He watched me with a gaze that was far too sharp for a late-night shift. It hit me then that Philip Grayson Victoria's shark of a lawyer must have been tracking my location through the trust's vehicle GPS. They were already hovering, waiting for the old man to stumble. I ignored the shadowed figure near the elevators and stepped into the lift, the $48 million weight of my decision pressing against my chest like lead. The elevator doors hissed open on the 18th floor, revealing Margaret standing like a sentinel in a hallway that suddenly felt far too narrow for the history we shared. Her expression was a fortress of professional composure, but I could smell the sharp, acidic scent of the midnight espresso she had clearly just brewed. I stepped out my boots, thudding against the plush carpet, still feeling the leaden weight of my decision in my chest. We didn't waste time on birthday pleasantries. I followed her into the conference room where the city of Portland spread out beneath us like a glittering, indifferent carpet of lights. Margaret spread the thick manila folders across the mahogany table. "Clause 7B is their oxygen, Margaret," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the climate control. "I want to see how they breathe without it." I looked at the ink-heavy pages, but I didn't see legal text. I saw the thousands of hours I had spent in a grimy workshop, the smell of grease and hot steel, building Garrison Architectural Hardware. My daughter viewed the results as a birthright, but to me, they were scars turned into gold. I revealed to Margaret that the $320,000 I had supposedly given Brendan for his startup wasn't the gift he assumed. It was a convertible note, a debt weapon I had quietly forged, with a specific moral conduct clause. By conspiring to raid the trust principal, he had triggered a breach. I was calling it in for immediate repayment. Margaret looked at me with a mixture of respect and something akin to fear. "You're not just trimming the hedges, Richard," she whispered. "You're salting the earth. Have you ever wondered how much a signature weighs? When it's the one that disinherits your only child, it feels like it's made of collapsing stars." I watched her hand me the amended documents. She explained that while the revocation was legally airtight, it required a 30-day administrative window for existing credit lines and leases to settle. It was a ghost period. Victoria and Brendan would continue their lifestyle of emerald silk and champagne, completely unaware that the reservoir had already run dry. The April 1st shock would be the sharpest lesson I could give. Let them have their last few weeks of delusion. I replied, my fingers tracing the smooth coldness of the silver pen. "It makes the ending sharper." Silence. The pen hovered. A drop of ink hit the paper like a black tear. I didn't flinch. I felt the resolute stillness of a builder who knows a structure is too rotten to save. "Sign here, Richard." Margaret said, her voice barely a breath. "After this, there is no turning back." As I prepared to scrawl the final stroke, a sharp, rhythmic chirp broke the quiet. The private fax machine in the corner began to spit out a sheet of paper. Margaret walked over, her brow furrowed, and as she read the letter, the color drained from her face. It was a notice from Victoria's legal team. She had just filed an emergency welfare check and an application for temporary guardianship, claiming my recent behavior proved I was suffering a total mental breakdown. My own daughter was trying to legally lobotomize me to keep the checks flowing. I pressed the nib to the parchment and scrawled my name, oblivious to the fact that Victoria's process servers were already in the elevator, coming to declare me unfit before the ink could even dry. The legal war didn't just begin, it had already turned into an ambush. And I watched the green checkmark appear on my computer screen with the cold satisfaction of a sniper who had finally found his range. Moments ago, Margaret had informed me that Victoria's process servers were practically banging on the wrought iron gates of the estate. But my own security team was playing a masterful game of bureaucratic delay. While they argued over the validity of entry permits, I remained anchored in the stillness of my study, my eyes fixed on the digital tracking interface. I didn't send just one letter. I had orchestrated a triple strike. One was at the Seattle penthouse, one was arriving at Brendan's glass cubicle office, and a third sat waiting at the front desk of the Olympic Hills Country Club. I wanted to ensure there was no dark corner of their curated lives where they could hide from the truth. "Let the lawyers dance at the gate, Margaret," I murmured into the speakerphone as I watched the status update. "I want to see the moment she signs for that envelope." My pulse was steady, a contrast to the frantic energy I knew was currently vibrating toward Seattle. I had paid for the very tracking technology they used to monitor their luxury deliveries, and now it was facilitating their downfall. Delivered. The word sat on the screen, green and glowing. It was the most expensive word I had ever written. In that instant, 200 miles away, the morning sun was likely hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows of their $4 million penthouse. Victoria Hayes and Brendan Hayes were probably finishing a brunch I had subsidized, unaware that the air in their rarefied world had just been vacuumed out. Do you know the sound of a foundation cracking? It doesn't scream. It's a quiet, jagged snap that happens while you're still deciding which wine to pour. I could almost hear it through the digital ether. The courier would have handed Victoria the heavy cream-colored envelope bearing the prominent seal of Fletcher and Associates. I imagined Brendan making some dismissive joke about the old man finally coming to his senses, or sending a formal birthday card to apologize for my existence. Probably just some paperwork for the Tesla lease, Victoria might have said, her fingers tracing the expensive stationery. "Open it." Brendan would have urged, his arrogance a thick shield against a reality he couldn't yet see. They were so accustomed to my signature being a precursor to a wire transfer that the idea of it being a death warrant was entirely alien to them. They sat in their glass tower, surrounded by Italian marble and the smell of expensive roast coffee, holding the physical manifestation of their disinheritance. As Victoria pulled the thick sheets of parchment out, she would have found a photo clipped to the very back of the legal jargon. It was a high-resolution screenshot of her suffocating text message, time-stamped and notarized as Exhibit A for the trust's immediate suspension. I had spent 70 years learning that if you want someone to respect your boundaries, you have to make the consequences visible. Victoria's hand began to shake so violently that the heavy parchment slipped through her fingers, fluttering toward the white marble floor like a falling leaf in a dead forest. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the peaceful quiet of wealth. It was the hollow, terrifying stillness of the void. Brendan reached for the paper before it even hit the floor, his laughter dying mid-breath as the gold-embossed seal of my law firm caught the morning light like a warning flare. He snatched the heavy parchment with a jagged motion, his fingers fumbling against the expensive grain. I imagined the confusion etched onto his face as he scanned the clinical, merciless language Margaret had prepared. Victoria stood frozen, her eyes tracking the movement of the paper, but her mind clearly lagging several steps behind the reality of the situation. "It's just a bluff." Vic Brendan spat his voice, reaching for a confidence it didn't possess. "The old man is throwing a tantrum because we asked for space. It's a dramatic birthday prank." He was trying to convince himself as much as her, but as he read further, his face paled. He discovered a secondary clause specifically targeting him. The $320,000 I had advanced for his startup office lease was being reclaimed effective immediately due to a moral conduct breach. The business capital he had treated like a personal lottery win was being vacuumed out of his accounts. Victoria smoothed her silk robe, her jaw tight. "I have a personal shopper waiting at Nordstrom," she said, her voice brittle. "I am not letting a piece of paper ruin my day." She was choosing the comfort of denial, a habit I had spent years inadvertently funding. She left the penthouse with her chin high, the smell of her expensive French perfume lingering in the stale air like the ghost of a life already deceased. Victoria walked into Nordstrom like a queen returning to her court, unaware that the crown had been melted down and the gates were being locked behind her. The store was a cathedral of consumerism, filled with the scent of high-end leather and the soft, rhythmic click of heels on polished marble. She moved through the designer floor with a practiced ease, selecting $14,000 worth of seasonal pieces with the casual air of someone picking up milk. She reached the counter and handed over her trust-funded American Express Centurion card, the black titanium, cool and heavy in her hand. The salesperson offered a polite practice smile that faltered almost instantly. Beep. The sound was small, but in the hushed luxury of the designer floor, it sounded like a gunshot. Victoria's brow furrowed, her fingers tapping impatiently on the glass. "There must be a mistake with your machine," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of a nearby shopper. "This card has a $50,000 limit." The salesperson tried a second time, then a third, the silence between them growing heavy and toxic. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Hayes, but the authorization has been denied by the issuer." The realization finally began to sink in that the certified letter wasn't a warning, it was an execution. Victoria pulled her phone from her bag, her hands shaking as she dialed the private banking line she had used for years. She expected a familiar voice, a concierge, to fix the error. Instead, she found that her personal login had been wiped from the system. She was informed by a cold recorded voice that she was now classified as a non-authorized third party to her own life. As the automated voice on the phone repeated the words, "Account terminated," Victoria looked up to see the store security guard glancing toward her, and she realized the safety net hadn't just frayed, it had vanished. The drive to Bellevue was a blur of frantic phone calls and unanswered emails, a desperate race to outrun a reality that was already waiting for us at the Valley stand. Victoria and Brendan had arrived at Bellevue at the Bay with a false sense of urgency, believing that if they just projected enough power, the universe, or at least my bank account, would bend back to their will. They were dressed in the armor of the social elite Victoria, in a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and Brendan in a suit, tailored to hide his mounting insecurity. They were shown to a prime window table, the kind that usually came with a nod of recognition from the staff. They ordered the most expensive Wagyu and a vintage Cabernet, as if spending more of my money would somehow make it reappear in their frozen accounts. "Order the Wagyu Vic," Brendan had whispered, his eyes darting around the room to ensure no one was watching too closely. "If we look like we're winning, he can't treat us like losers. He's just an old man with a bruised ego. He will fold by Monday." I had anticipated this exact brand of hubris. I knew they would reach for the highest shelf when they felt the floor falling away. To make the lesson stick, I had intentionally left exactly $50 in their joint checking account. It was just enough to trigger the blue light of the overdraft protection alerts on their smartphones, a digital warning chime that would vibrate against the mahogany table as they ate, without actually being enough to cover the bill for their last supper. The restaurant was a cathedral of wealth, and we were the heretics, about to be excommunicated in front of the entire congregation. The air was thick with the scent of seared fat and expensive perfume, the soft clinking of silver against bone china, providing a soundtrack to their delusion. The check eventually arrived, a modest $487, compared to their usual Friday night excesses. The theater of humiliation began with a single sharp beep. The Trust American Express was the first to fall. Beep. Victoria's personal MasterCard followed seconds later. Beep. Brendan's business card, which he swore was independent of the trust, was rejected, with the same clinical indifference. Beep. Finally, their backup debit card failed. Beep. 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 4 strikes, and the world I'd built for them was officially out. The hushed atmosphere of the dining room curdled into a suffocating silence as the server returned for the 4th time. Sir, all 4 cards have been declined for insufficient funds or account frozen, the waiter said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the neighboring tables. Is there someone else we should call? Victoria's face was the color of bleached bone. Nearby diners began to whisper, the familiar glint of smartphone lenses reflecting the candlelight as they captured the scene. Brendan was forced to make the call he dreaded most. He dialed his younger brother, a man he had belittled for years as a middle-class plotter, and had to read a credit card number over the phone while the restaurant manager stood over them like a debt collector. The 5th attempt, his brother's card went through. As they stumbled out toward the valet, I saw a flash of a phone screen in the window. Someone had already posted the video with the caption, "The Hayes Empire card declined." The sunrise over Seattle didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene punctuated by the rhythmic mechanical groan of a hydraulic lift right beneath our bedroom window. I lay in my bed 300 miles away, but I could envision every detail of the morning I had orchestrated. My phone sat on the nightstand, silent and heavy. I didn't just stop the lease payments for Victoria's white Tesla. I had explicitly called the total loss department of the dealership to report the vehicle as abandoned by me, the primary guarantor. I gave them the exact address of the penthouse and told them I would no longer be responsible for the asset. Victoria must have heard that heavy diesel engine idling on the street, a sound so out of place in her quiet, curated neighborhood. I can imagine her rushing to the balcony, her breath fogging the glass, only to see a flatbed tow truck positioned like a predator behind her car. The 30-day administrative window Margaret had warned them about hadn't just closed, it had slammed shut. Brendan was likely still asleep, dead to the world, in a room filled with furniture I paid for, while the physical manifestation of their status was being hoisted away. I had instructed the repossession agent to be prompt. Victoria would have screamed for Brendan to get up, her voice cracking with a primal panic, as she realized someone was taking the one thing that still gave her a semblance of mobility. "It is not a theft, ma'am," the man with the clipboard would have told her, his voice weary with the routine of debt. "It is a recovery. Your account is 15 days delinquent, and the guarantor has withdrawn support." Watching that Tesla tilt onto the flatbed was like watching my daughter's ego being loaded into a trash compactor, expensive, shiny, and completely useless without a charge. Victoria didn't stay on the balcony. She would have run downstairs in her silk pajamas, a designer robe fluttering behind her as she hit the sidewalk. I know my daughter. She would have tried to use my name like a shield, unaware that I was the one who had sharpened the sword. "Do you have any idea who my father is? He will have your job for this." She would have shouted, her face flushed with the kind of social humiliation that leaves a permanent mark. "Ma'am," the agent likely replied without looking up from his tablet, "your father is exactly the one who notified the leasing company to come pick up the keys. Neighbors I've never met, and the building doorman who used to treat Victoria like royalty, were surely watching in hushed, jagged silence." Snap. The chains tightened. The world didn't end with a bang, but with the sound of steel against a reinforced chassis. The smell of exhaust fumes and wet pavement would have filled the air as the flatbed began its slow departure. As the car was pulled away, the angle of the lift would have shifted the items inside. Victoria likely noticed a gym bag and a set of unfamiliar keys sliding across the back seat items that confirmed Brendan was using the car for his secret Belltown trips, right up until the final hour. The tow truck pulled away with a cheerful chirp of its yellow lights, leaving Victoria standing in the rain, clutching a designer robe that no longer felt like armor as she stared at the empty space where her dignity used to park. The silence in the penthouse after the car was gone was louder than the engine that took it, and it drove my daughter and her husband into the cab of a rented U-Haul, their last bridge to the world I had built for them. I sat in my second-floor study watching through the high-definition security monitors as that bright orange and white eyesore rumbled up the winding driveway of my Oregon estate. The reason they had been evicted from their Seattle sanctuary so quickly was not merely due to non-payment. 2 weeks ago, I had personally reached out to their landlord and purchased the outstanding debt on the property, effectively becoming their creditor. I was the one who signed the final notice that pushed them onto the street. Now they stood at my heavy iron gates, pressing the intercom button with a frantic, rhythmic desperation that echoed through the house. Victoria's voice was ragged, stripped of its usual polished cadence as she begged me to open the gates. "Dad, please," she cried, her face a distorted mask of pixels on my screen. "They locked the penthouse. Everything we own is in this truck." Brendan tried a different tactic, leaning toward the speaker, to demand an emergency loan to get them through the month, still unable to grasp that the Bank of Dad was permanently closed. I watched them, my hand hovering over the unlock button but never pressing it. Do you know what it is like to watch your own child beg for a life they never worked for? It is a specialized kind of pain that feels like swallowing broken glass. I could see the sweat on Brendan's brow, even in the morning, missed his eyes darting toward the road, as if expecting another collector to materialize. Silence. I did not say a single word. I just watched the pixels of their faces distort on the screen until they did not look like family anymore. They looked like strangers attempting a home invasion. When they refused to vacate the driveway, I placed a silent call to Marcus, my head of security for 12 years, who pulled his black patrol car up behind the U-Haul with the silent efficiency of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. Marcus stepped out, his posture resolute, and calmly informed them that they were trespassing on private property. "Mr. Garrison has requested that you vacate the premises." "Immediately," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the intercom. "Any further contact will result in a police escort." Victoria's desperation turned into a feral rage. She began screaming insults through the mail slot of the gate pillar, her hands clawing at the wrought iron. "You are a monster, Thane," she shrieked. "You are going to die alone in that big house." Brendan, ever the coward, tried to hide his face from the security guard's body camera, pulling at Victoria's arm to get her back into the truck. In her fury, she accidentally let the truth slip, screaming at Brendan that it was his fault for losing the survival cash they had managed to get from pawning their wedding gifts at a high-stakes poker game in Tacoma. My daughter had become a gambler's accomplice, trading her last remnants of dignity for a seat at a losing table. I watched the taillights of the U-Haul disappear down the driveway. Victoria's final scream echoed through the intercom before the line went dead, leaving me with a haunting realization she was not sorry for what she did. She was only sorry she could not do it anymore. The first call came at 11:03 p.m., a digital vibration that signaled the start of a month-long siege against my resolve. I sat in the darkness of my study, the blue light of the monitors casting long, cold shadows across the mahogany desk. I was no longer reacting. I was documenting. I had installed professional-grade call logging software that didn't just bypass the blocks Victoria attempted to circumvent. It stripped away her anonymity. Every time she used a friend's phone or one of the 19 burner numbers she rotated through the system pinged a map on my screen. I watched the red dots cluster around a luxury hotel in Tacoma, proving that while she claimed to be sleeping in the cab of that U-Haul, she was actually charging a premium suite to whatever credit line she had managed to keep hidden. I opened a fresh spreadsheet on my laptop, the cursor, blinking with the same surgical detachment I felt in my chest. 147 calls, 89 texts, 34 emails. I cataloged each one with the precision of an actuary. This wasn't a daughter reaching out in a moment of crisis. It was a denial of service attack on my life. "I need this documented, Margaret," I told my attorney during our morning check-in. "When they eventually sue, I want every scream categorized." I watched the data grow, a jagged mountain of evidence. Victoria's messages followed a predictable, frantic cycle. She would begin with sobbing apologies at midnight, transition to vitriolic threats of exposing my financial abuse to the press by 3 a.m., and finish with cold, entitled demands by breakfast. Ping, ping, ping. The sound of entitlement at 3 a.m. is a very specific frequency of annoying. It is the sound of a parasite realizing the host has developed an immune system. I listened to a voicemail left on May 15th, a day when the Oregon rain was particularly relentless. Victoria's voice had shifted to a haunting, forced sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Dad, please," she whispered, the artifice of her grief practically dripping through the speaker. "I went to the doctor. I'm pregnant. Don't punish the baby for what Brendan and I did. We just need enough for a clinic visit and a deposit on a small studio." For a fleeting second, the old enabling instinct flickered in my gut, a phantom pain from a limb I had already amputated. How many lies does it take to bury a father's love? Apparently, Victoria thought 89 texts would do the trick. I pulled up the private archives I kept of her social media footprints. 3 weeks prior to her miracle conception, she had been tagged in a series of blurry photos at a yacht club gala, laughing with a champagne flute in her hand. The math didn't just fail, it insulted my intelligence. I added the voicemail to the log under the category of fraudulent inducement, my heart turning to a solid block of stone. I was no longer her father. I was the auditor of her soul, and her accounts were bankrupt. As I scrolled through the final entries for the evening, I noticed a discrepancy in the email logs. Brendan had been sending me long, groveling apologies for his role in the trust raid, promising to pay back every cent. Yet the same logging software showed he was simultaneously sending encrypted instructional emails to a private investigator in Seattle, seeking dirt on my private life to use as leverage. I closed the spreadsheet for the night, the raw data, proving my daughter and her husband had crossed the final line from family into predator. I forwarded the entire file to Margaret, with a simple note: "The trap is set. Bring me the Belltown report." The manila folder sitting on Margaret's desk was 47 pages of pure, unadulterated betrayal, bound together by a single steel clip that felt like the only thing keeping my world from spinning out of control. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the familiar scent of old law books, and Margaret's expensive tea grounding me as I reached for the dossier. I had spent decades reading blueprints and hardware specifications, but these pages outlined an architecture of deceit more complex than any skyscraper. My hands were steady, a cold, clinical calm settling over me as I flipped the cover. The report detailed Brendan's secret life in Belltown with a precision that was almost poetic. Over 18 months, he had diverted exactly $87,400 from joint accounts funds I had provided to maintain a secret condominium for a yoga instructor named Sienna Matthews. I stared at the surveillance photos of Brendan entering the sleek lobby with groceries and fresh flowers. Those were the small domestic gestures Catherine had loved, now bought with the remnants of her legacy for a mistress. I discovered a deeper layer to the rot when I realized Sienna was actually the sister of Brendan's supposed business partner. It meant the entire startup venture I had subsidized was likely nothing more than a hollow front designed for money laundering from the family trust. $87,000. "Margaret," I said, my voice as flat as a desert floor. He wasn't just cheating on my daughter, he was billing me for the privilege of his infidelity. "It gets worse, Richard," Margaret replied, her voice soft but heavy. "Look at tab 4, the text. Click, tab 1, click, tab 2. Each yellow sticker was a nail in the coffin of the man I once called my son-in-law. I moved through the pages until I reached the subpoenaed text logs between Brendan and Sienna. I felt my heart harden into a diamond-sharp point of focus. Tab 3 held surveillance photos with dates April 14th. Brendan kissing Sienna outside the Belltown condo. May 3rd entering with an overnight bag. May 19th holding hands at a restaurant. 5 more images showed the same pattern of intimacy bought with my money. One particular message from March 10th, sent just 5 days before my 70th birthday, jumped off the page. "Rich old man won't last forever, lol," Brendan had written. "Just need trust money first." Have you ever seen your own death warrant written in emojis and LOLs? It's remarkably efficient at curing a broken heart. I realized then that Brendan wasn't merely enabling Victoria's distance. He was the primary architect of it, coaching her to maintain just enough of a connection to keep the inheritance within reach while they waited for me to stop breathing. "Rich old man won't last forever," I I repeated, looking out the window at the Portland skyline. I suppose I should thank him for the clarity. I feel younger than I have in decades. I feel like a man who has finally been given a reason to fight. I kept reading, hoping to find a shred of Victoria's innocence in the wreckage, but the next page offered a different kind of blow. Margaret pointed out that Victoria had been BCC'd on several of the emails regarding the mistress's rent payments. It suggested my daughter might have known about the second life Brendan was leading and chose to look the other way, sacrificing her dignity to keep her comfortable world intact. I closed the folder and looked at Margaret, the anger finally burning off into a cold, hard strategy. Does Victoria know the full extent of this? I asked. My mind was already moving toward the next step, a calculated dismantling of the parasitic life they had built on my back. That evening I sat alone in my study with the investigator's folder closed on my desk, wrestling with the question Catherine would have asked me. Do you tell her I imagined 3 scenarios? First, tell Victoria immediately about the affair. She divorces Brendan, but she still hates me for cutting her off. I'm vindicated but seen as cruel and interfering. Second, stay silent and let her discover it naturally. But that could take months or years, and meanwhile Brendan keeps manipulating her. Third, wait for the right moment. Use the evidence strategically when it will have maximum impact and force both of them to face the consequences of their choices together. I thought about Catherine's teaching philosophy. Natural consequences are the best teachers. I chose the third path. I called Margaret and told her to prepare a full dossier. Every piece of evidence from the past 6 weeks. The harassment log, the investigator's report, the financial records, the legal notices. Everything. Margaret asked A, meeting with whom Victoria and Brendan, I said. Together. One final time. Margaret was silent for a moment, then said, You're going to show them everything. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yes. I want them to understand exactly what they've done. Margaret asked. When I looked at my calendar, June 6th, 2024, 2 p.m., your conference room. The invitation was sent on heavy cream cardstock, the kind Victoria usually associated with high society galas. But this time, the gold embossed seal was a lure for a predator, not a welcome for a guest. I watched Margaret run her finger over the raised lettering in her Portland office, the morning light catching the sharp edges of the paper. This was the final piece of the architecture I had been building since the night of my 70th birthday. I had already overseen the installation of high-definition recording equipment in the primary conference room, discreetly tucked away behind the mahogany paneling. Even more critical was the live feed I had established to the secondary boardroom down the hall. In that room, the University Endowment Board would be sitting in silence, waiting to witness the formal transfer of the $48 million Hayes legacy. Victoria and Brendan wouldn't know they were being televised to the very people who were about to inherit their presumed birthright. Margaret and I carefully crafted the text of the summons to sound like a weary peace offering. We used vague bureaucratic phrasing like discussing the future of the Hayes family trust and establishing parameters for potential reinstatement. I wanted to exploit the specific brand of greed that had blinded them for years. Make it sound like I am tired, Margaret, I said, leaning back in the leather chair. Make them think they have finally worn me down. Margaret nodded her pen, scratching across the draft. Desperate people don't read the fine print, Richard. They only see the dollar signs. I knew they were currently suffering in a cramped Tacoma rental, and that desperation was my greatest ally. Greed is a blindfold that makes the edge of a cliff look like a red carpet, and I was counting on them to walk it with a smile. On June 1st, I sat in Margaret's office and listened on speakerphone as Victoria called to confirm their attendance. Her voice was a jarring mix of forced humility and hidden triumph, a performance she had practiced until it almost sounded sincere. We have learned our lesson, Margaret, she said, though I could hear the sharp edge of her excitement. We just want to make things right with Dad. Are there specific reinstatement documents we should bring to expedite the process? I felt a cold chill hearing her lie about their growth, while knowing they were calling from a borrowed burner. Phone because their own lines were dead. Bring your husband, Victoria, Margaret replied, catching my eye. This concerns the entire family structure. Click. The line went dead. She was coming. They were both coming. The slaughterhouse was open for business. I felt a grim satisfaction settle into my bones, a clarity that only comes when the path is finally clear. My security software gave one final ping before I left for the day. Brendan, ever the optimist of other people's money, had already contacted a luxury car dealership in Seattle. He was trying to reserve a new Porsche 911 using the pending trust reinstatement as proof of future funds to secure the hold. He was already spending the money I was about to give away to strangers. I looked at the clock on the wall and realized that in exactly 72 hours, the two people who had spent my birthday plotting my downfall would finally get exactly what they deserved. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and the actors were in place for a finale they never saw coming. June 6th arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on the glass peaks of Portland, a perfect ceiling for the trap I had spent 3 months building. I arrived at the Pioneer Tower, long before the scheduled hour, sequestering myself in the security monitor room adjacent to Margaret Fletcher's primary suite. I watched the lobby feed with the clinical detachment of a man observing a laboratory experiment. To heighten the atmosphere of vulnerability, I had already instructed the building manager to set the conference room air conditioning to a biting 64 degrees. I wanted my daughter and her husband to feel the chill of the world they had claimed to want space from. When Victoria and Brendan finally entered the lobby, I leaned closer to the screen. The downgrade was jarring. Victoria was wearing a wrinkled Target brand blouse and a pair of clearance rack jeans that fit poorly, while Brendan's expensive charcoal suit hung off a frame that had clearly lost significant weight from the stress of a month without my subsidization. They looked like frightened children called to the principal's office, eyes darting toward the security desk with a mix of hope and terror. "They look thinner, Margaret," I said into the intercom, my voice a low rumble. "Hunger is a powerful teacher." Margaret's voice came back crisp and warning. "Don't let the costume fool you, Richard. They are here for the check, not the connection." A pang of pity tried to surface in my chest, but I crushed it instantly with the memory of that red heart emoji sent as a dismissal. I was no longer a father to be exploited. I was the auditor of their reckoning. A hug. She actually tried to hug me when I finally stepped into the conference room. The audacity of a predator trying to cuddle its prey is almost impressive. I physically rebuffed her, stepping aside with a stiff nod and taking my seat at the head of the long mahogany table. Victoria's arms fell to her sides, her face flushing as the cold air of the room hit her. I did not offer them tea or small talk. Margaret activated the projector, and the hum of the machine was the only sound as the first slide burned into the white wall. Hayes Family, Trust Financial. Summary, 2021 to 2024. I watched the color drain from Victoria's face as I began to walk them through the ledger of their entitlement. I spoke calmly, detailing the $45,000 monthly deposits, the $4 million penthouse down payment, the lavish wedding, and the secret bailouts for Brendan's recurring failures. The grand total sat at the bottom in bold black ink. $2,348,000. I didn't realize. "I never added it up," Victoria whispered, her hands shaking on the tabletop. "Do you know what $2 million looks like when it's printed on a single sheet of paper? It looks like a waste of a life." "That is because you didn't have to add it up, Victoria," I replied. "You just had to ask, and I, in my grief, provided." I watched her swallow hard, her eyes fixed on that staggering number. She began a rehearsed apology, her voice trembling as she mentioned the birthday text and her need for growth. I interrupted her with a click of my pen. "We aren't here for apologies yet," I said. "I noticed a specific $50,000 line item in your joint records labeled Tacoma Legal Retainer." Victoria opened her mouth to explain the legal fees, but I raised a hand, my eyes fixed on the projector screen. "Don't lie yet, Victoria. We haven't even reached the evidence of misconduct." The hum of the projector was the only sound in the room as Margaret clicked to slide 2, and the date at the top of the email, March 12th, hit my daughter like a physical blow. Victoria flinched, her eyes widening as she recognized her own typing on the glowing screen. I didn't have to hack into their devices or bypass encrypted firewalls to find this. The lawyer they had so confidently hired, Philip Grayson, was forced to disclose these communications during a targeted elder fraud discovery process. Margaret had triggered the legal avalanche the moment she flagged the suspicious $50,000 withdrawal. "March 12th, Victoria," I said, my voice echoing in the chilled air of the conference room. "You weren't worried about my space then. You were just worried I would live long enough to change my mind." In the email, Victoria had laid out a case for my significant cognitive decline, coaching Grayson on how to best frame me as a senile shell. She was asking for the fastest route to establish a conservatorship. She wanted my freedom. "Where did you get these?" she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "Those are private communications." She reached for the table as if to steady herself, her knuckles white against the dark mahogany. "Have you ever read a description of your own cognitive decline written by the person who used to hold your hand while crossing the street? It is a very specific kind of literature." I watched her eyes dart to Brendan, who was suddenly very interested in the grain of the floorboards. Margaret scrolled down to show Brendan's reply in the thread. He hadn't just agreed. He had eagerly volunteered to serve as co-conservator. He suggested that once the trust was secured, I should be moved to a high-end assisted living facility in eastern Oregon. His reasoning was clinical. It would reduce oversight costs and keep me far enough away to prevent any sudden changes in my will. "A high-end facility in the desert?" I asked, leaning forward. "You always were so generous with my own money, Brendan." He tried to speak his throat, working visibly. We thought you were making bad decisions," he managed. "We were scared for the family legacy." The irony was a bitter weight in the room. They called me a monster for reclaiming what I had built. Yet they were planning to lock me away like a broken tool in a shed before the cake for my 70th birthday was even baked. Silence. March 12th, 3 days before the text. The suffocation she felt wasn't from my love. It was from the wait for me to sign the last check. Victoria tried to claim the emails were just talk, a moment of frustration caught in a digital draft. But I gestured to the projector again. Slide 3 materialized, revealing a signed petition for guardianship. It was a formal, finalized document that was only hours away from being filed on the morning of my birthday. They hadn't just been talking, they had been loading the gun. Brendan stood up his chair, screeching against the floor in a jarring metallic protest. But Margaret didn't even look up from her laptop. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," she said with a chilling professional calm. "We haven't even touched on your extracurricular activities in Belltown yet." The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as the next folder was opened. Brendan's knees buckled back into the chair as Margaret slid the first stack of high-resolution surveillance photos across the table, the glossy paper catching the light like a serrated blade. He didn't try to stand again. I watched him deflate his expensive suit, shoulders slumping as the secret life he had built on my dime spilled out across the mahogany surface. I had orchestrated this revelation with a specific kind of architectural cruelty. The Belltown condo where these photos were taken, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the Sound, is actually owned by a holding company I purchased last month. I am technically his mistress's landlord, a fact that gave me access to every security log and maintenance request he ever filed. Margaret methodically laid out the images of Brendan with Sienna Matthews. There he was buying lilies at a street corner, kissing her outside a yoga studio, and holding her hand at a restaurant in Pioneer Square, all during times he had told Victoria he was networking for his fledgling startup. Victoria picked up one of the photos, her hand shaking so violently the paper rattled against her wedding ring. "Who is she, Brendan?" she whispered, her voice a jagged wreck. "Who is this woman you are kissing while I am crying over my father?" Margaret didn't let him answer. Sienna Matthews, 29. My attorney stated, her voice as dry as parchment. "You have been paying her $2,800 a month for 18 months, Brendan. That totals exactly $50,400 of my client's money. Have you ever heard the sound of a woman realizing her entire life was a script written by a parasite? It sounds like a sharp intake of breath that never quite finds its way out." I sat back, the resolute coldness of my study replaced by the clinical air of this conference room. I reached into the file and pulled out the subpoenaed text logs. I wanted the words to hurt as much as the images. "Rich old man won't last forever, lol." I read aloud, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "Is that what I am to you, Brendan? A countdown clock? A legacy you've already started spending before the pulse even stops?" Victoria stared at the logs, her eyes bloodshot. It wasn't just the infidelity. It was the sheer calculated greed of the man she had defended against me. "Victoria, it is not what it looks like." Brendan stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit. I was venting. It didn't mean anything. Smack. The sound of the slap echoed off the glass walls. It was the first honest thing Victoria had done in years. She stood there, her chest heaving, her chair knocked backward on the plush carpet. As she continued to scan the logs, she let out a guttural sound of pure repulsion. She realized that Brendan hadn't just been waiting for me to die. He had been texting my primary physician, trying to bribe him for a fake diagnosis of dementia to speed up the conservatorship. He was trying to bury me alive while sleeping in a bed I paid for. Victoria turned to me, her eyes pleading and wet. I didn't know, Dad. I swear I didn't know. I leaned forward, the hum of the projector, the only thing between us. I didn't move to comfort her. There is still one more thing, Victoria, and this one is all you. I watched her flinch as I reached for the medical folder tucked at the bottom of the stack. I pulled a medical folder from the stack, the one Victoria had sent me, with so much fake hope attached, and the way she looked at it told me she knew her last line of defense was about to be incinerated. I had spent months dissecting her lies with the same precision I once used to measure steel tolerances for garrison architectural hardware. Victoria's face already streaked with tears, and the sharp sting of her own realization went ashen as I opened the cover. I didn't just have a hunch, I had an invoice. I presented a digital receipt I'd unearthed from her records, $425 paid to a freelance graphic designer for ultrasound editing. I felt a cold, jagged spike of moral repulsion as I revealed that the miracle grandchild she used as bait for our reconciliation was nothing more than a composite of stock photos. The irony was particularly sharp because the designer she hired was a former intern at my company who had recognized the Garrison name and flagged the suspicious request to my corporate security. Months ago, Victoria collapsed into her chair, her silk blouse rustling against the leather, as Margaret began to read the clinical affidavit from a real gynecologist. The document confirmed that there had never been a pregnancy, much less the miscarriage Victoria had used to twist the knife of my guilt. You used a child that didn't exist to try and steal from a father you claimed was suffocating you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was desperate, Dad. She wailed, her hands clutching the edge of the mahogany table. I thought, if you believed there was a baby, you would look at me again. You would give us another chance. How do you value a grandchild who is made of pixels and greed? It turns out the market price for a fake life is exactly zero. I watched her, seeing only the hollow architecture of the woman I had raised. Brendan sat beside her, staring at the ceiling, already mentally calculating his next exit strategy, but there were no more exits. I stood up and adjusted my wool coat, the fabric feeling heavy and honest against my shoulders. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the final notarized trust documents, laying them on the table with a quiet, decisive thud. The $48 million has been legally and irrevocably transferred to the Catherine Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, I stated. It is done. The ink was dry. The bridge was ash. I didn't feel like a winner, but for the first time in years, I felt like a man. I looked at the two people who had planned to lock me in a desert facility and realized they were now the ones truly imprisoned by their own choices. I hope you find a way to become people your mother believed you could be, I told them, my hand on the door handle. But you will have to do it on your own dime. Dad, don't leave us like this. We have nothing. Victoria's scream followed me into the hallway, but I didn't turn back. I had designed the scholarship fund to specifically prioritize students from the very same Tacoma neighborhood where they were currently hiding. They would have to see my legacy in the faces of every successful student they passed for the rest of their lives. I stepped into the elevator and press lobby, the weight of the fortune finally lifting, unaware that Victoria was already reaching for her phone to call the one person I hadn't blocked. The ignition of my car in the quiet parking garage was the first note in a long, silent symphony of peace. A mechanical vibration that seemed to shake the last of the Hayes family trust dust off my skin. I gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel, the interior of the sedan smelling of cedar, and the faint, lingering scent of the expensive espresso Margaret had served earlier. I eased the car out of Pioneer Tower, leaving the wreckage of my daughter's life behind in a high-rise conference room. The drive south toward my estate was a 180-mile stretch of gray asphalt and evergreen trees. I chose to leave the radio off, preferring the rhythmic thrum of the tires over the forced cheer of a broadcaster. Throughout the journey, I had a secondary burner phone resting in my cup holder. It was a device I kept for a singular purpose, receiving reports from the building manager of the Tacoma basement, where Victoria and Brendan were currently taking refuge. He was a man I paid well to ensure I knew every move they made. "It is done, Catherine," I whispered to the empty passenger seat. "The rot is out, but the house is still empty." I felt a profound, hollow exhaustion settle into my bones, the kind that follows a brutal but necessary surgery on one's own history. I methodically replayed the meeting, watching Victoria's face shift from smug anticipation to that visceral, skin-crawling shame as I dismantled the pregnancy fraud. Driving south was like watching the ink of my old life dry in the rearview mirror, permanent, dark, and impossible to smudge. I was moving away from the noise and toward the fortress of my own choosing. I found myself fixated on the smallest details of the betrayal, the specific, sharp tone of Victoria's wail when the money vanished, and the way Brendan's eyes darted toward the exit the moment his mistress's photos hit the table. About halfway home, I pulled over at a desolate rest area. The smell of damp pine needles and gasoline hung in the air. I took out my primary phone and opened the photo gallery. I stared at the screenshot of the suffocating text message and that mocking red heart emoji. This was my anchor. 60, 70, 80. The speedometer climbed as I merged back onto the highway, but my heart rate stayed at a steady rhythmic thrum. I was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Whenever my resolve flickered with a father's natural guilt, I stared at that digital heart until my chest turned back into iron. "You like the distance, sweetheart," I thought, as the miles blurred past. "Now you get to live in it." The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long bruised shadows over the dormant lavender garden as I finally pulled into my driveway. Just as I reached the estate gates, my tablet pings with a sharp, intrusive news alert. A local Seattle journalist had already published a blind item about a billionaire disinheriting his only child over a text. Victoria had moved faster than I anticipated, leaking a slanted version of the truth to buy herself public sympathy. I pulled the key from the ignition and sat in the dark for 10 minutes, watching the first star appear over Catherine's garden, unaware that the one person I hadn't blocked was currently typing a reply that would set the media world on fire. The morning sun hadn't even cleared the Oregon pines when the first phone call from a reporter hit my landline. A jagged electronic intrusion into the peace I'd spent $48 million to buy. I sat at the kitchen island, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold, while I stared at the digital screen of my tablet. The silence I had cultivated during the drive home was officially dead, replaced by the persistent, shrill demand of a world that suddenly felt entitled to an explanation for my private life. I realized then that the one person I hadn't blocked, my late wife's sister Sarah, had been the bridge Victoria needed. Sarah had always harbored a quiet resentment toward my success, and she had provided Victoria with the childhood photos and family narratives necessary to fuel a fire that was now burning through the Seattle media circuit. She claimed she was helping Victoria recover her inheritance, but she was really just handing my daughter the matches. I scrolled down the Seattle Tribune's homepage and found the lead story on page 3. The headline made my blood run cold. "Billionaire father abandons daughter in revenge over single text message." The journalist Carla DeSantos had painted a heart-wrenching picture of Victoria Hayes, portraying her as a humble warehouse worker struggling for $16 an hour, discarded by her titan of industry father. The article was a masterpiece of selective editing. It completely omitted the context of the conservatorship plot, Brendan's blatant affair, and the elaborate medical fraud involving the fake ultrasound. Instead, it focused entirely on the perceived cruelty of disinheriting an only child on the very day I celebrated my 70th year. Have you ever seen your own soul cherry-picked and edited into a villainous caricature? It's amazing what a talented journalist can do with a few missing facts and a lot of adjectives. The text quoted Victoria extensively, her words dripping with a rehearsed fragile grace. "I made a mistake," she told the reporter. "Instead of talking, he destroyed my life. I just want my dad back." The court of public opinion was already in session, and the verdict was trending toward my total condemnation. I stared at the photograph accompanying the article, a grainy, sentimental shot of a father-daughter dance from 1995. Victoria was 9, wearing a white lace dress, her hand tucked safely into mine. Using a photo from 30 years ago to justify a lie in the present was a low I hadn't expected even from her. Ring, ring. The world wanted a monster, and Victoria was more than happy to hand them a leash. The phone began to ring incessantly, a cacophony of former business associates and distant acquaintances demanding to know if the story of my sudden madness and vindictiveness was true. "Mr. Garrison, this is the AP, a voice barked when I finally made the mistake of answering. Do you have a comment on your daughter's claims of homelessness? I felt the pressure mounting a physical weight against my temples. I looked back at the screen and discovered the final insult, a donate button for a GoFundMe page Victoria had set up. It had already raised $25,000 in sympathy capital within 2 hours of the article's publication. People were paying for the privilege of hating me. I hung up on the 10th reporter and dialed Margaret, my jaw set, in a hard, resolute line. Don't respond publicly yet, Margaret whispered as soon as she picked up. We are going to let them get comfortable in their lie before we set the fire. I looked out at the lavender garden, the purple blooms swaying in the wind, and prepared for the long wait ahead. 12 days of strategic silence followed a vacuum that I used to gather every receipt, every photo, and every lie into a pile of dry kindling that was about to meet a very large match. I spent those mornings in the cool shadow of my study working with Margaret to ensure our counterstrike was not just a denial, but a total annihilation of the victim narrative Victoria had peddled to the Seattle Tribune. I had even quietly reached out to a contact who controlled a shell company that provided back-end funding for the Tribune's fact-checking department. By the time I was finished, the paper's legal team realized they were staring down a massive defamation suit unless they issued a front-page retraction and apology. I didn't want their apology, though. I wanted them to see the truth. Thomas Brennan, a veteran investigative journalist with eyes that had seen 30 years of Portland's darkest secrets, looked at my dossier like it was a gift from God when I met him at the Portland Register newsroom. He ran a hand over the notarized copies of the March 12th conservatorship emails and the Belltown Mistress surveillance. This isn't just a family feud, Richard, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, as he leaned over the desk. This is a series of felony-level exploitations. I nodded, my face a mask of resolute iron. I'm not looking for a puff piece, Thomas. I want the truth to be the only thing they have left. Brennan didn't disappoint. He spent 48 hours verifying the edited ultrasound invoice and the corporate security logs from Garrison Architectural Hardware. Click, upload. The world took a breath. Then the world started to scream, but this time they weren't screaming at me. The 3,000-word expose titled The Whole Story Inside the Hayes Family Trust Dispute hit the wire on a Tuesday morning. It was a surgical operation of a story. It laid out the clinical reality of the $50,000 legal retainer Victoria had paid to seize my freedom just days before she sent that birthday text. Brennan included a sidebar about the Catherine Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund, contrasting Victoria's greed with the 120 full-ride scholarships I was providing to students in the very neighborhood where she was currently hiding. The internet is a court with no judge and a jury that moves like a school of piranhas. Victoria had just fallen into the water and she was bleeding. Within 6 hours, the Associated Press picked up the story, and the national media began a violent pivot. Public sympathy is a fickle thing. It curdles into outrage the moment people realize they've been conned. Victoria's GoFundMe was flagged for fraud and suspended the $25,000 frozen before she could touch a cent of it. I sat in my kitchen watching the numbers on the screen. The GoFundMe is gone, Richard, Margaret said over the phone, her voice sounding lighter than I'd heard it in months. Good, I replied. Let them see the woman behind the mask. But as the sun began to set over the lavender garden, a final jagged piece of news arrived via an anonymous tip. Brendan had already fled their Tacoma rental, taking what little cash remained from the mistress's rent money and leaving Victoria alone to face the fallout. A text appeared from a number I'd long since blocked, but the notification preview on my screen was enough to chill my blood. You ruined me. The social execution was total, but the economic collapse was just beginning. I sat in my study, the Oregon fog pressing against the windows, watching the fallout of the Portland Register article ripple through the mundane reality of Victoria's survival. She had been working as a temporary stalker at a massive warehouse in Tacoma, a job she likely viewed as a stage for her starring role as the wronged heiress. I discovered through a private report that the warehouse manager who summoned her to his office was actually a former foreman from my original workshop. He was a man who knew the calloused hands it took to build the Garrison name, and he had no patience for the parasitic drama Victoria brought into his facility. My security team intercepted a screenshot from the warehouse workers' social media group that morning. Anyone know what happened to Victoria at the South Seattle Distribution Center? She got called into the manager's office this morning and didn't come back. Her locker was cleaned out by lunch. He presented her with a printout of the expose alongside a detailed log of her company phone usage. We hired a worker, Victoria, not a tabloid drama. He had told her, his voice devoid of the sympathy she craved. You used our time to harass an old man. She had made dozens of personal calls during her shifts, continuing her campaign of digital bombardment against me while on the clock. The manager also cited 3 separate coworker complaints. Victoria had been venting about her rich father and asking for loans constantly. It's not what they said, she had screamed, her desperation echoing through the corrugated steel of the office. My father is a monster. He is paying people to lie. Her accusations fell on deaf ears. Fired on the spot at exactly 10:47 a.m., her badge was revoked and her access cut. Locker cleaned, badge revoked. The heiress was officially just another unemployed statistic in a high-vis vest. I watched the forensic trail of her afternoon as she spiraled. She tried to rally her former circle, reaching out to 12 different friends from the country club, but the piranhas of the social elite had already sensed blood in the water. They had seen the evidence of the fake pregnancy and the secret legal plots. They didn't just hang up, they blocked her. Even Sarah, my late wife's sister, who had initially fueled Victoria's fire, sent a final blistering email. She was disgusted by the medical fraud and wanted no further contact. That afternoon, Margaret forwarded me another piece of collateral damage. Brendan's ride-share delivery account had been deactivated after a series of 1-star reviews from customers who recognized his name from the news. What do you do when your last life fails? For Victoria, the answer was screaming at a brick wall in a Tacoma parking lot. They are all gone, Richard Margaret told me over a late afternoon call. 12 outreaches today, 12 hang-ups. I looked out at the dormant lavender, my face set in its usual mask of calm. When you build a life out of mirrors, you shouldn't be surprised when people stop looking. I felt a grim sense of justice, but it was tempered by the hollow reality of the destruction. Victoria was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a soggy cardboard box containing her locker contents. My investigators even caught wind of her final desperate gamble. She tried to sell the rights to her true story to a reality TV producer in Los Angeles. The producer declined within the hour, citing the legal evidence of her fraud as too toxic for television. She wasn't an underdog anymore. She was a liability. I watched the final photo of her sitting on the curb, her head in her hands, and felt a cold, familiar question rising in my chest. Is rock bottom deep enough to plant a seed of truth? Or is she already planning her next scam? The handwritten letter arrived 5 weeks later, postmarked from a P.O. box in Tacoma, the paper smelling faintly of cheap coffee and regret, rather than the expensive perfume she used to spray on everything I owned. I sat in my study, the late summer heat pressing against the windows, and traced the loop of my daughter's handwriting. It was a 3-page manifesto of her supposed transformation. Victoria claimed she had finally severed ties with Brendan, moving into a $950 studio and working 2 manual labor jobs to become someone Catherine would be proud of. She even attached a paycheck stub for $487.60 from a local coffee shop as a humble offering of proof. I have no right to ask for forgiveness, she wrote, her ink slightly smudged. I just want you to know I'm finally earning my own way. Could she really be changing, or was this just the most elaborate script? Yet I had a private investigator sitting 2 tables away when I finally agreed to meet her at the Riverside Cafe, and his report later noted that she hadn't arrived by bus as she claimed. She had been dropped off 2 blocks away by a luxury SUV hidden behind tinted glass. I watched her through the drab window of the cafe, feeling the old protective instincts of a father warring with the hardened steel of my resolve. When I stepped inside, the physical change in her was shocking. She was significantly thinner, her face devoid of the expensive makeup that usually served as her mask, and she was dressed in faded clothes that looked like they came from a clearance bin. She ordered a black coffee for $2.50, her fingers trembling as she meticulously counted out the exact change from a small worn coin purse. Have you ever seen a woman who used to spend $1,000 on a handbag count out pennies for a lukewarm cup of joe? It is a masterclass in performance art or a miracle. The problem was I couldn't tell which. We sat in a booth that smelled of stale grease and floor wax. She cried quietly, apologizing for the suffocating text and asking genuine questions about the students receiving the new scholarships. She didn't mention money once. "I am going to therapy, Dad," she whispered, her eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since she was 10. "It is a $25 copay. It is all I can afford, but I need to fix what is broken in me. I am not here for the trust thane. I am here because I miss my father." Change, clink, clink, clink. $2.50. The price of admission to my heart had apparently dropped significantly. I wanted to believe her, to reach across the laminate table and tell her it was over, but the ghost of her previous betrayals stood between us like a wall of glass. As we stood to leave, she reached out and squeezed my hand, her skin rougher than I remembered. She slipped something into my coat pocket, a small, heavy object. I drove away from Tacoma feeling the first crack in my armor in months, my mind reeling from the sight of her diminished state. When I reached the estate, I pulled the gift from my pocket. It was a locket that had belonged to Catherine. My heart hammered against my ribs until a call from my investigator confirmed that the locket had been pulled from a local pawn shop inventory just 2 days prior. I felt the dangerous flicker of hope begin to sour. A single phone call from Margaret 48 hours later was about to turn that flicker of hope into a pillar of fire. Margaret's voice on the phone didn't sound like a friend's. It sounded like a surgeon reporting a relapse, cold and clinical enough to freeze the blood in my veins before I could even ask what was wrong. I was standing in my kitchen, the morning light hitting the granite counters in jagged, unforgiving streaks. She didn't lead with pleasantries. The investigator flagged a meeting Victoria had with Vanessa Holt 4 days before your coffee date, she said. I felt the name hit like a lead weight. Vanessa Holt was a litigation specialist known for one thing: aggressive elder abuse claims. They had traced a payment of $4,500 for a legal retainer, a sum Victoria certainly hadn't earned at a coffee shop. I listened, my grip tightening on the phone, as Margaret explained that Victoria wasn't trying to fix her soul. She was building a narrative of isolation and financial abuse to present in court. The coffee wasn't an apology, Richard, Margaret added with a heavy sigh. It was a deposition rehearsal. My daughter had spent our meeting crafting a persona of a victim to make me out to be a jailer. The realization that the tears I'd watched fall into her black coffee were part of a billable hour hit me with a sickening thud. I had been able to track these transactions because Victoria, in her haste, used a rewards card linked to an old joint email address she'd forgotten to scrub. She was paying for my destruction with a trail I could follow in real time. I turned my attention to a second receipt the investigator had uncovered: $350 paid to Acting Truth Studios in Seattle for a session titled Emotional Presentation Coaching. The invoice listed specific training modules: vocal tremor control, authentic tear production, body language for remorse, and micro-expressions of vulnerability. Every gesture I had seen at the cafe, the meticulous counting of the change, the specific fragile way she mentioned her therapy copays, the trembling hands as she clutched the worn coin purse had been rehearsed, refined, and bought for $350. I paid for her life for 30 years, and now she was paying a professional to teach her how to lie to me about it. Performance art, that was all she had left. My daughter wasn't a worker finding her way. She was the lead actress in a high-stakes play about my own cognitive ruin. Check the studio logs, Margaret, I said, my voice dropping into that familiar surgical coldness. I want to know exactly which daughter she is playing next. The fury I felt was no longer hot. It was a calculated, icy resolve. I discovered that the luxury SUV the investigator saw wasn't just a random ride. It belonged to Vanessa Holt's law firm. The bus ride she'd described was a complete fabrication, orchestrated by her legal team to sell the image of a woman at rock bottom. I closed the laptop and looked at the locket on my desk, the one she had left in my pocket with such feigned sentiment. I knew now it wasn't a gift or a memory. It was a prop for the upcoming trial, a piece of evidence meant to show her enduring love before I supposedly lost my mind. The doorbell rang at 8:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, a sharp, repetitive sound that signaled the end of the reconciliation performance and the official start of the siege. I sat in my second-floor study watching the security feed as a nondescript plain sedan idled at the estate gates. I felt a strange cold peace as I observed the man in a windbreaker approaching the intercom. The ambiguity of the coffee shop apology, with its carefully rehearsed tears and calculated counting of change, was finally being replaced by the hard clarity of a legal maneuver. I had already prepaid Margaret a $100,000 litigation retainer, weeks ago specifically anticipating this exact move after the acting coach discovery. I was not going to be caught flat-footed by a script I had already read. Marcus intercepted the man at the gate, but the server simply held up a thick manila envelope, his voice crackling over the intercom. "Are you Richard Hayes, Garrison? You have been served." I leaned into the microphone and instructed Marcus to accept the service. "The mask is off?" "Marcus," I said, my voice steady. "It is almost a relief." I watched him hand over the documents and drive away, leaving the heavy weight of Victoria's true intent sitting on the gate pillar. A few minutes later, Marcus brought the envelope to my study. I didn't rush to open it. I already knew the scent of this betrayal. It was the smell of high-end ink and desperate greed. How do you calculate the price of a daughter's love? According to Vanessa Holt, the elder abuse specialist Victoria had hired, it is exactly $45,000 a month, adjusted for inflation. I opened the digital line to Margaret, and we began to dissect the three primary claims. Constructive abandonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress via the Portland Register expose, and a rather creative breach of oral contract regarding lifelong support. $7.2 million. That was the price Victoria put on our history. She is selling her childhood for the price of a used private jet. She is suing for constructive abandonment. Margaret, I noted, tracing the lines of the complaint with a steady finger. Oregon doesn't even recognize that for adult children. Margaret's voice was a dry rasp through the speakers. "It is a fishing expedition, Richard. They want you to pay to make the headache go away. They want to use the discovery process to prove you are a controlling, abusive patriarch. Are we settling?" I looked at the Catherine Hayes Memorial Scholarship documents sitting on the corner of my desk, the only legacy I cared about now. "No," I replied. "We are going to war." As I flipped to the final page of the complaint, the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I saw the list of supporting witnesses. Brendan Hayes was listed as the primary witness against me, his testimony, supposedly verifying years of my financial control and emotional manipulation. The realization hit me with the surgical precision the divorce Victoria had cried about in the cafe was a sham. They hadn't split at all. They had simply reorganized their tactics to make Victoria look more sympathetic for the judge. I looked at Brendan's name on the witness list and smiled a cold, sharp expression that felt more like a bared tooth than a grin. They thought they were dragging me into discovery, but they had just given me a subpoena to tear apart their fraudulent divorce in open court. The deposition room was a sterile box of white walls and fluorescent lights designed to make even the truth feel like a confession. But Vanessa Holt didn't realize I'd built my career in rooms much colder than this. Vanessa Holt sat across from me, a shark in a tailored charcoal suit, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, which were the color of a cold Pacific morning. She adjusted her legal pad, the gold nib of her pen poised like a harpoon. I settled into the hard plastic chair, my hands resting loosely on the laminate table. I felt the aggressive, strategic calm that had served me for decades settle over my shoulders. Vanessa didn't waste time on pleasantries. She leaned forward, her voice a sharp edge. "Mr. Garrison, do you enjoy watching your only daughter wither in a warehouse while you sit on millions?" she asked, her tone dripping with practiced moral indignation. I didn't blink. I enjoy the clarity that comes when people are forced to live the lives they've earned. "Ms. Holt," I replied. I had already purchased the building that houses her law firm 3 weeks ago, making me her landlord. That investment had given me legal access to the common area security footage, showing her and Victoria meeting in the lobby multiple times to polish this performance. Vanessa's frustration began to show in the way she tapped her pen. She tried to rattle me with questions about weaponized wealth and the emotional trauma of being discarded on a birthday, but I provided short, factual answers that refused to trigger her emotional traps. Click! The tape recorder whirred. Vanessa leaned in. I leaned back. The air in the room was exactly 64 degrees, just the way I like it. Before I reveal what happened next, let me ask you something. If you're still here with me in this story, leave a comment so I know you're still following along. You can write just one number or even a single word. Do you think what she did was desperation, or was it another calculated move? And one quick note before we continue, the next part of the story contains a few fictionalized details added to enrich the narrative. If that's not something you'd like to listen to, you can choose to stop the video here. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the receipts for the Acting Truth Studios and the GPS logs from the luxury SUV that had dropped Victoria at the cafe. This wasn't a cry for help, I stated, sliding the documents across the table. It was a rehearsal for this very moment, and I believe you have the invoice for it in your own ledger. The room went silent. The financial ties between the victim and her legal rescuers were now laid bare on the record. Vanessa's polished veneer cracked her eyes, darting to the papers. You see, when you're as rich as I am, people think you're the target. They forget that the person with the money is usually the one who bought the range. I dropped the final document on the table, a signed affidavit from Brendan's mistress, Sienna. She had turned against him after I offered her a far more stable housing arrangement. She was ready to testify that the divorce was indeed a fraudulent sham designed specifically to bolster this lawsuit. Vanessa Holt's pen snapped between her fingers, the ink staining her palm like a fresh wound, as I stood up to leave the $7.2 million threat, now looking like a very expensive joke. I looked at her, then at Margaret, and walked out without a second glance. Courtroom 4. B smelled of old floor wax and the stale, desperate sweat of people who had run out of lies, a fitting sanctuary for the final burial of my daughter's ambitions. I sat behind Margaret, my back straight against the hard wood of the gallery bench. Judge Miller presided over the bench with a face like weathered granite, a man who had heard every lie in the city and had long ago lost his taste for them. I felt a preternatural stillness. In my pocket I carried a document. Margaret and I had drafted a private settlement offer that would have provided Victoria a modest monthly stipend for 5 years. It was a father's last reach for mercy. But as I watched Victoria take the stand and attempt to weave one more tale of my supposed cognitive decline, ignoring the forensic evidence of her own fraud, I felt the last chord of my affection snap. Under the table, my fingers found the paper and tore it into 4 silent pieces. Vanessa Holt attempted a final flailing argument about moral obligation and the sacred bond between parent and child, but the judge looked visibly unimpressed by the lack of legal standing. Counsel, your client's definition of distress seems to include the consequences of her own documented fraud. Miller noted, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. I watched Victoria, who looked smaller and more fragile than ever in a suit that was clearly borrowed. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and a plea for rescue, but she found only the surgical indifference I had spent months perfecting. This was never a legal case, Your Honor. Margaret stated it, her voice cutting through the tension. It was an attempted heist. Gavel. Wood on wood. The sound of a $48 million door slamming shut. Judge Miller didn't hesitate. Case dismissed with prejudice, he announced. I'm referring the matter of the fraudulent ultrasound and the attempted bribery of a medical professional to the district attorney's office for review. Victoria collapsed into her chair as if her bones had turned to ash. Furthermore, the court orders the plaintiff to cover the defendant's legal fees in full. That ruling effectively incinerated the last of her GoFundMe remnants and whatever sympathy capital she had left. It was over, Victoria. Truly over. Victoria looked at me like I was a monster. I looked at her like she was a blueprint I'd finally decided was too flawed to build. As the courtroom cleared, the final betrayal arrived not from me, but from her own camp. Vanessa Holt handed Victoria a thick bill for unpaid legal services and walked away toward the elevators without a single word of comfort. The victim's advocate was only ever interested in a contingency fee that had just vanished into the Oregon mist. I walked past Victoria in the hallway without breaking my stride, the click of my heels on the marble sounding like a clock resetting to 0. But the look Brendan gave me from the shadows near the elevators told me the snake still had enough venom for one final desperate strike. The scent of lilies in the university hall was a haunting echo of Catherine's funeral. But today they didn't represent a life lost. They heralded $48 million worth of futures found. I stood backstage in the university auditorium, the heavy velvet curtain, a thick barrier between me and the expectant hum of the crowd. I adjusted my silk tie in the mirror, my reflection showing a man who looked older perhaps, but undeniably lighter. On the small table beside me sat a framed photo of Catherine from the summer we turned 50. I looked at her smile and felt a profound, quiet surge of vindication. We did it, Catherine, I whispered. The money is finally safe. It is finally doing what you wanted. I reflected on how close I had come to letting Victoria and Brendan turn this legacy into a Belltown condo and acting classes for professional liars. To ensure the integrity of this rebirth, I had quietly insisted that the scholarship selection committee include an anonymous seat for the warehouse manager who had fired Victoria. I wanted the merit criteria enforced by someone who understood the visceral difference between a genuine worker and a practiced grifter. Mr. Garrison, the dean is ready for your opening remarks, a young assistant whispered. I gave the photo one last pat and stepped into the light. Dean Henderson, a man whose academic robes seemed to carry the weight of the university's 200-year history, offered me a nod of profound respect as I approached the podium. The auditorium was packed with faculty and the first cohort of scholarship recipients, 120 individuals, who represented the hard work and raw grit Catherine valued above all else. Standing before these students was like watching 48 million seeds finally hitting fertile soil after decades of being locked in a cold, sterile vault. I delivered my speech briefly, focusing not on the fortune, but on the fact that effort is the only currency that truly buys a future. Then I called the first recipient to the stage. Sofia Martinez stood with a posture that reminded me of a young Catherine, shoulders back, chin up, and eyes that had seen enough struggle to know the value of a single open door. She was a first-generation student who had worked 3 jobs while maintaining a near-perfect GPA. As she reached the podium, her eyes were wet with a gratitude that felt entirely real. My mother didn't believe in handouts, Sophia, I said, my voice carrying through the silent hall. She believed in hand-ups. This is yours because you earned it. Sophia gripped my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. Thank you, Mr. Garrison, she whispered. You didn't just give me money. You gave me a life I didn't think I was allowed to have. I saw in her the spark I had once desperately hoped to see in my own daughter, a genuine hunger for a better life, earned through sweat rather than entitlement. Flash. The cameras clicked. But for once I wasn't the target. The future was. I smiled for the official photo, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for decades. But then I noticed a security guard at the back of the hall, tensely gesturing toward the exit. My phone gave a low, urgent vibration in my breast pocket. It was a ping from Marcus. Brendan had been spotted near the service entrance wearing a fake press badge and attempting to force his way inside. I kept my smile fixed for Sophia, but my eyes remained locked on the swinging doors at the back of the hall, where the shadow of a man I thought I'd buried was waiting to turn this celebration into a final, desperate scene. The applause was thunderous, but all I could hear was the low, urgent vibration of the security alert in my breast pocket. A digital heartbeat warning me that the past wasn't finished with its haunting. I maintained my smile for the cameras, my hand still firmly gripping Sophia's, but my focus had shifted to the periphery. I watched Marcus move. He didn't run. He flowed through the crowd with the practiced ease of a predator, converging on the shadow near the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. Brendan hadn't come alone. My internal security feed later confirmed he had a freelance photographer waiting near the main entrance, ready to capture a staged confrontation for a tabloid sale. It was a pathetic last-ditch effort to monetize the wreckage of his reputation. Marcus thwarted the plan with a silent professional elegance, guiding Brendan through a side exit before a single flash could go off. I caught a glimpse of Brendan's face as the doors swung shut, haggard, desperate, and radiating a poisonous envy that no longer had a target to bite. "You're in the wrong room, mister." "Hayes." I heard Marcus's voice through my earpiece, cold and final. "Let's move this outside. I have a right to be here. This is family money." Brendan's muffled shout was cut off by the heavy thud of the latch. Gone. Brendan was a ghost in a cheap suit excised from my life like a tumor. The air in the auditorium suddenly felt breathable, the oxygen no longer being consumed by his parasitic presence. I finished the official photos with the dean, my pulse steadying as the crowd began to disperse for the reception. My gaze drifted to the very last row of the auditorium, far from the celebratory lights and the persistent clicking of the university's press team. There, shrouded in the shadows of the deep balcony overhang, sat Victoria. She wasn't shouting or demanding. She was simply sitting, dressed in a borrowed coat, muted gray and ill-fitting, that seemed to swallow her whole. Her face was a mask of profound, silent realization as she watched Sofia Martinez being hugged by a sobbing, proud mother. For the first time, I saw not a grifter or a predator, but a woman finally crushed by the weight of the very space she had demanded on my birthday. Have you ever watched someone realize they are the antagonist in their own story? It is a quiet moment, no music, just the sound of a heart finally admitting it was wrong. She didn't come for the money today. She came to see what it bought. I looked at her, and for once I didn't want to look away. I wanted her to feel the silence. I noticed her fingers were working restlessly, clutching a small, crumpled program from the event. Even from the stage, I could see that the back of the paper was covered in frantic, overlapping scribbles. I would later find that program left on the seat. She had written, "I'm sorry," over and over again, hundreds of times, not as a message for me to find, but as a private, desperate ritual of regret. Victoria stood up to leave before the house lights came all the way up her movements, slow and weighted. The way she paused at the door, her hand resting on the brass handle for one heartbeat too long, made me wonder if this was truly the end, or if she was waiting for me to say the one word I hadn't used in a year. That night, Margaret texted me, "Investigator, confirmed, Victoria. Took bus from Tacoma 4 hours each way. Didn't try to approach you." 2 weeks later, on December 26th, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. Postmarked Tacoma, December 23rd. Inside was a single handwritten page. "Dad, I was at the ceremony. Stood in the back. Saw that girl hug you. Heard what you said about Mom. Remembered her saying, 'You can be more.' You were right about everything. I took you for granted. Tried to steal. Lied. Let Brendan use us both. Got a second job overnight stocking. Saved $340. Going to therapy, $25 copay. All I can afford. Don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I finally understand. V. I read it 3 times in the cold December air. I thought about the August coffee, the acting coach, the staged tears, the lawsuit. I thought about the fake pregnancy, the conservatorship plot, the 147 calls. But I also thought about the borrowed coat and the 4-hour bus ride. I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't reply. 3 weeks passed in silence. The letter remained there unopened after the first reading, like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I didn't call out her name at the auditorium. The distance she asked for was a gift I intended to keep giving. But it seemed the vacuum I'd created was already being filled by scavengers I hadn't seen in a decade. I drove back to my estate with the image of Victoria in the last row burned into my mind, her hands clutching that crumpled program. For a few hours, I allowed myself the luxury of believing the war was over. I was wrong. By the time I opened my laptop in the silence of my study, an urgent brief from Margaret Fletcher was already waiting. It was a notice of interest filed by a group of distant cousins from Idaho on Catherine's side relatives who had been ghosts since the funeral. I felt a cold, familiar anger tighten my jaw as I scanned the names. I discovered that Victoria hadn't just been sitting in that auditorium to reflect. She had provided these Idaho cousins with the internal trust account numbers they needed to file this specific challenge. It was a calculated betrayal, a secondary strike launched under the cover of her "I am sorry" ritual. They were claiming that my transfer of $48 million to the scholarship fund was the impulsive act of a grieving man being manipulated by university boards. The Miller cousins, I said into the phone as soon as Margaret picked up. Catherine wouldn't let them in the house when she was alive, and now they want to manage her legacy? Margaret's voice was weary. They're claiming you're liquidating the family heritage out of spite, Richard. It is a messy angle, but it gives them standing to freeze the next round of scholarships. I trust with $48 million is just a carcass in the desert. You can chase away the hyenas, but the vultures are always circling higher, waiting for the wind to change. These people didn't care about Catherine. They saw blood in the water and a chance to claim what Victoria had forfeited. Silas Miller, a man with a smile like a cracked tombstone and a legal history that read like a manual on how to weaponize spite, was the last person I wanted to see in my inbox. I remembered him clearly. He was the kind of man who would burn a forest just to sell the charcoal. He had once tried to sue Catherine over a rusted tractor she'd inherited, and now he was leading the charge to stop the very help Sophia Martinez had just received. The legal attack was sophisticated questioning the prudential management of the trust's sudden 90% depletion. They don't want the truth. I told Margaret, my fingers tapping a sharp, impatient rhythm on the desk. They want a settlement. They think I am too tired to fight another war. Silas Miller. The name tasted like rust and cheap whiskey. I should have buried them all years ago. The irony was a bitter weight in my chest. By punishing my daughter, I had opened the door for people even less deserving to claim a piece of my hard-earned empire. Then Margaret dropped the final hammer. She had just discovered that the lawyer, representing the Idaho cousins, was Vanessa Holt, the same litigation coach Victoria used for the coffee shop ploy. The entire family was now consolidated into one final legal assault. I looked at the signature on the affidavit and realized Victoria hadn't just paused at the auditorium doors to regret her life. She was waiting to see if I'd noticed her setting the next fire. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred into a single sharp point of calculated defiance. They wanted a war of attrition, but I was still the man who built the fortress. I didn't call out her name at the auditorium. The distance she asked for was a gift I intended to keep giving. But it seemed the vacuum I'd created was already being filled by scavengers I hadn't seen in a decade. I drove back to my estate with the image of Victoria, in the last row, burned into my mind, her hands clutching that crumpled program. For a few hours, I allowed myself the luxury of believing the war was over. I was wrong. By the time I opened my laptop in the silence of my study, an urgent brief from Margaret Fletcher was already waiting. It was a notice of interest filed by a group of distant cousins from Idaho on Catherine's side relatives, who had been ghosts since the funeral. I felt a cold, familiar anger tighten my jaw as I scanned the names. I discovered that Victoria hadn't just been sitting in that auditorium to reflect. She had provided these Idaho cousins with the internal trust account numbers they needed to file this specific challenge. It was a calculated betrayal, a secondary strike launched under the cover of her "I am sorry" ritual. They were claiming that my transfer of $48 million to the scholarship fund was the impulsive act of a grieving man being manipulated by university boards. The Miller cousins I said into the phone as soon as Margaret picked up. Catherine wouldn't let them in the house when she was alive, and now they want to manage her legacy. Margaret's voice was weary. They're claiming you're liquidating the family heritage out of spite, Richard. It is a messy angle, but it gives them standing to freeze the next round of scholarships. A trust with $48 million is just a carcass in the desert. You can chase away the hyenas, but the vultures are always circling higher, waiting for the wind to change. These people didn't care about Catherine. They saw blood in the water and a chance to claim what Victoria had forfeited. Silas Miller, a man with a smile like a cracked tombstone and a legal history that read like a manual on how to weaponize spite, was the last person I wanted to see in my inbox. I remembered him clearly. He was the kind of man who would burn a forest just to sell the charcoal. He had once tried to sue Catherine over a rusted tractor she'd inherited, and now he was leading the charge to stop the very help Sofia Martinez had just received. The legal attack was sophisticated questioning the prudential management of the trust's sudden 90% depletion. They don't want the truth, I told Margaret, my fingers tapping a sharp, impatient rhythm on the desk. They want a settlement. They think I'm too tired to fight another war. Silas Miller. The name tasted like rust and cheap whiskey. I should have buried them all years ago. The irony was a bitter weight in my chest. By punishing my daughter, I had opened the door for people even less deserving to claim a piece of my hard-earned empire. Then Margaret dropped the final hammer. She had just discovered that the lawyer representing the Idaho cousins was Vanessa Holt, the same litigation coach Victoria used for the coffee shop ploy. The entire family was now consolidated into one final legal assault. I looked at the signature on the affidavit and realized Victoria hadn't just paused at the auditorium doors to regret her life. She was waiting to see if I'd noticed her setting the next fire. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred into a single sharp point of calculated defiance. They wanted a war of attrition, but I was still the man who built the fortress. The Oregon estate was waiting for me, a fortress of solitude that felt larger than it had a year ago, its hallways echoing with the phantom footsteps of a family I had systematically dismantled for the sake of the truth. I dropped my keys onto the side table, the metallic clatter, sounding abrasive in the oppressive stillness. I had won in Idaho. I had scorched the earth beneath Silas Miller and Philip Grayson. Yet as I entered my study, the victory felt like a heavy cold shroud. Sitting on the center of my blotter was a plain, unmarked courier envelope. It hadn't come through Margaret's vetting process or my secure digital channels. I tore it open, expecting another forgery, another desperate attempt by Victoria to claw her way back into my checkbook with a faked ailment. I discovered, however, that the file wasn't sent because Victoria had requested it. A note from a nurse at a Seattle Municipal Hospital explained that she had recognized the garrison name on a chart, with no listed emergency contact beyond a disconnected number. I initially stared at the thick medical file with a sneer, wondering which acting coach had taught her how to forge a PET scan. "What is this, Victoria?" I muttered to the empty room. But as I flipped through the pages, the clinical terminology began to pierce my defensive armor. There were no emotional pleas, no requests for wire transfers, just the dry, terrifying language of biopsies and oncology reports. Malignant, inoperable, metastatic. The words didn't care about my legal retainers or my forensic audits. I reached the summary page and felt the world tilt on its axis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I looked at the dates of the initial lab work. They were taken 3 months after I had cut her off during the height of her phase as a warehouse worker. While I had been documenting her harassment and tracking her movements, the cells in her own body had been staging a far more lethal coup. She had been dying in silence in a public clinic, not the high-end specialists the trust once provided. How do you apologize to a dying woman for being right? The victory I'd chased for a year suddenly tasted like ash and chemotherapy. I realized with a crushing physical weight that for the first time since the birthday text, she wasn't lying. She had been working in a warehouse with a death sentence in her gut, and I had been winning legal wars in Idaho. I won. I won every case, and now there's nothing left to save. I felt my hands tremble, a sensation I hadn't felt in 70 years. I sat in the gathering shadows of my study, the medical evidence of my daughter's final devastating reality spread before me like a map of my own failures. At the very back of the file, tucked behind a scan of her liver, I found a small, yellow, sticky note. It was in her handwriting, dated weeks ago, presumably left for the hospital staff. "Don't tell him. He finally has the piece he wanted." I picked up the phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed the one number I had sworn never to call again. I prayed to a God I hadn't spoken to since Catherine died, that it wasn't too late to be a father one last time, even if it was only to watch the light go out. The car was idling in the driveway, the engine's low thrum urging me toward a mercy I hadn't felt in years. But a single misplaced pixel in the hospital's logo caught my eye and stopped me cold. I had been seconds away from driving toward Seattle, my heart heavy with a guilt that threatened to dismantle a year of cold logic. I pulled the key from the ignition, the sudden silence of the garage ringing in my ears like a warning bell. I walked back into my study, my movements stiff, driven by the nagging sense of too perfect timing that had always protected my business interests. I placed the medical file under my high-resolution architectural scanner, magnifying the biopsy reports and PET scans until the microscopic world of the document was laid bare. I discovered that the Stage 4 report was not just a forgery, it was a ghoulish recreation. The underlying imagery in the scans matched Catherine's original 2012 medical records with terrifying precision. Victoria had stolen her mother's records to make the lie physically undeniable to me, grafting her own name onto Catherine's death warrant. The kerning on the M was off by a fraction of a millimeter. Hospitals do not use variable spacing on automated lab results. I checked the medical license number for the listed oncologist. It belonged to a retired pediatrician living in Florida. The diagnosis that had almost broken my resolve began to dissolve back into the digital ink of a master forger. How much does it cost to buy a fake death on the internet? Apparently it is about $3,000 in Bitcoin and the absolute soul of the woman who used to be my daughter. I felt the last flicker of a father's warmth turn into a block of surgical ice. I picked up the phone and contacted the forensic digital specialist I'd retained during my hardware company's patent wars. I needed the metadata, the digital fingerprints of this ghost. We traced the nurse's email and discovered it had been routed through the same Tacoma VPN used during the Acting Truth Studios scandal. My specialist confirmed my darkest suspicions within the hour. "Sir, the file was created 48 hours ago," he said, his voice flat. The handwritten note at the back, it was scanned in from a tablet. Victoria hadn't just lied about a baby, she had weaponized her mother's death to simulate her own. The medical file wasn't a death warrant. It was a fishing lure, and I had almost let the hook set deep in my throat. I watched as he uncovered a blockchain transaction from Victoria's secret Idaho account to a dark web document service specializing in high-end medical forgeries. The miracle of her silence wasn't growth or regret. It was a high-stakes gamble on my remaining grief. I discovered that she had even pre-recorded a posthumous video to be sent to me after a fake disappearance designed to trigger a massive trust payout to Brendan as her widower. The depth of the deception was a canyon I could no longer see the bottom of. I put down the magnifying glass, the final illusion shattered by the same surgical precision that built my empire. I realized that rock bottom for Victoria was a place that didn't exist. She would dig forever if she thought there was gold beneath the dirt. I turned off the study lights and walked to the window, watching the sunrise over the garden I would never let her see again. And I deleted the one number I had almost called, this time for eternity. The morning air was crisp, clean, and entirely devoid of ghosts, until Detective Rourke's cruiser crunched up the gravel, bringing the stench of the precinct into my sanctuary. Detective Rourke was a man built out of coffee and cynicism, with a suit that looked like it had been slept in, and eyes that had seen too many daughters break their fathers' hearts for a paycheck. I stood on the porch, my hands steady as I watched him step out of the car. I already knew why he was here. My security system had pinged me the moment a formal police inquiry regarding my name hit the database. Victoria had finally played her most desperate card. Detective Rourke tipped his head toward me, his expression unreadable. She told the station you were being held here against your will, Mr. Garrison, that your fortress was a prison and your mental state had deteriorated to the point of danger. I didn't flinch. I simply turned and gestured for him to follow me into the study. My daughter has a talent for fiction, detective, but as you can see, she is a terrible proofreader. I led him to the architectural scanner, which still held the magnified, dissected pieces of the Stage 4 cancer forgery. I watched Rourke lean in, his brow furrowing as I systematically walked him through the dark web receipts and the metadata that proved Victoria had weaponized her own mother's death records to simulate her own terminal illness. I showed him the font-kerning discrepancies and the Florida medical license number. Rourke, a veteran of 1,000 domestic disputes, sighed deeply. The realization that he was being used as a pawn in a sophisticated grift settled over him like a heavy coat. Felony. The word hung in the air like smoke. My daughter, the felon. It had a certain tragic ring to it. I watched the detective's hand hover over his notepad. This goes beyond a civil suit, he muttered. Using deceased persons' medical records for fraud is a felony in this state. I moved the conversation toward the terrace, needing the fresh air to cut through the clinical coldness of the evidence. I presented the call logs now reaching over 200 attempts, and the evidence of Victoria impersonating a medical nurse to deliver that fake file. This is no longer a family disagreement, detective. It is stalking and criminal impersonation. Rourke admitted that while the probate court might be finished with her, the state might not be. I watched his expression shift from professional skepticism to genuine disgust as the full scope of the manipulation was laid bare. How many times can you kill a father's heart before the law finally steps in to collect the remains? I am not looking for an arrest today, detective. I told him, my voice reflecting a grim finality. I am looking for a permanent record. I want the truth documented so thoroughly that she can never find another shadow to hide in. Rourke nodded, but before he turned to leave, he dropped one final piece of information that chilled the marrow of my bones. He mentioned that Victoria didn't come to the station alone. She was escorted by a man matching Brendan's description, proving the ex-husband was still the one driving the getaway car. Rourke stepped back into his car, but the way he looked at the gate as he left made me realize that the final move wasn't going to be in a courtroom, but in the dark of a Tacoma night. The silence that followed Rourke's departure was the heaviest of my life, a total vacuum of sound, where the past finally stopped screaming and the ledger of my life felt ready to be closed. I sat in my study, the blue light of my computer screen illuminating the finality of the Garrison Estates transformation. I was reviewing the last financial audit, a 22-month summary of a grand redistribution. The numbers were clean, stark, and absolute. $48 million had been fully deployed into the Catherine Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund. The legal fees for the wars in Idaho and Seattle were settled and filed. My own overhead had been reduced to a minimalist hum, the excess stripped away like rotted bark from a healthy tree. 22 months. It took less than 2 years to undo 30 years of mistakes. I realized then that I was no longer the rich old man to be managed or the victim of a calculated heist. I was a man who had successfully curated his own ending. The accounts are clean, Catherine. I whispered to the empty room, the scent of aged paper and floor wax the only answer. There is nothing left for them to burn. I felt a sense of philosophical completion, a closure that didn't require an audience. I was finally free of the weight of an empire that had become a gilded cage for people who didn't know how to build anything. 3 a.m., the hour of the wolf, or in this case, the hour of the grocery clerk. I found myself driving through the quiet, fog-choked streets of Tacoma, a final unannounced trip born from a need for a visual period to my long sentence. I pulled my car into the far corner of a 24-hour grocery store parking lot at 3:12 a.m., keeping the engine off and staying deep in the shadows. Through the bright fluorescent glare of the plate glass windows, I saw Victoria. She wasn't the socialite I had raised, nor the victim the newspapers had portrayed, and certainly not the master forger who had nearly broken me. She was a woman in a stained green apron, her hair pulled back into a messy utilitarian knot stocking heavy crates of produce. I watched her heave a box of apples onto a shelf, her movements mechanical and slow. She looked exhausted. The acting coach polish was gone, replaced by the genuine bone-deep fatigue of manual labor. She was finally experiencing the space she once demanded, now filled with the hard, cold reality of earning a living. In the shadows of the lot, I noticed a beat-up silver sedan. Brendan was slumped in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a cheap phone. My former son-in-law, the once aspiring startup CEO, had devolved into a man living off the meager wages of a shelf stocker, acting as her 3 a.m. ride. Is it cruelty to watch your child struggle, or is it the ultimate form of respect to let them finally stand on their own 2 feet? Even if those feet are tired and sore, I didn't get out of the car. I let her keep her space. As I shifted into reverse, my headlights swept across the store's community board near the exit. There, pinned between a lost cat flyer and a local plumbing ad, was a bright scholarship flyer for the Catherine Hayes Fund. Victoria has to walk past her mother's charitable legacy every single night. She goes to work a reminder of the merit she lacked and the life she threw away. I pulled out of the lot and headed toward the highway, the headlights cutting through the Tacoma fog, knowing that the text I'd received 22 months ago was finally irrevocably answered. The lavender in the garden lay dormant under a light dusting of January snow, the purple stalks waiting silently beneath winter's grip for the spring that would come without me watching. I walked through the estate grounds with a slow, deliberate pace, my breath misting in the cold Oregon air. Today was January 28th, 2026. I was now 72 years old, my birthday having passed last March. It had been 22 months and 13 days since the birthday text that had prompted my search for justice. The property had transformed into a true sanctuary. The lack of noise was profound. No frantic phone calls from creditors, no legal demands from aggressive shark lawyers, and no more performative apologies rehearsed in acting studios. I spent the better part of the morning walking the frozen paths. Catherine had loved so much the crunch of frost beneath my boots, the only sound in the quiet. I reflected on the 120 students whose futures were now anchored by the trust I had fought to protect. I realized that the suffocation Victoria once complained about was actually the immense, unguided weight of my own love. I had finally found a way to redirect that energy toward people who would use it to build their lives, rather than burn them for a momentary glow. "It is quiet now, Catherine," I said to the wind, feeling the cold Oregon winter morning against my face. Not the silence of a grave, but the silence of a finished work. They have their space. And I finally have mine. Buzz. The stone bench hummed. A ghost was trying to call from the machine. I'd left my phone on the weathered granite bench while I rested. As the pale winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered lawn, the device vibrated with a singular persistence. I walked over my joint stiff from the cold and looked down to see a single text message from Victoria. It wasn't a demand for a wire transfer, a forged medical report from a dark web service, or a lawyer's threat of constructive abandonment. It simply said "Dad," followed by a single red heart emoji, the exact same symbol that had served as her dismissal 22 months ago. I looked at the glowing screen for a long time, weighing the authenticity of a daughter who was currently stocking grocery shelves at 3 a.m. against the memory of the woman who had tried to steal my freedom and my mind. Is a red heart a peace offering or a white flag from a defeated soldier? At my age, the difference is purely academic. You are 22 months too late for that heart to mean anything, Victoria, I thought. But I didn't type the words. I didn't block her either. Blocking requires an active expenditure of energy that I was no longer willing to provide. Instead, I made a definitive choice. I set the phone back down on the stone bench, the screen still bright with her unanswered reaching. I turned my back on the device and walked toward the house, leaving the message to glow in the deepening twilight. I closed the heavy oak doors of the study and turned the lock, the faint light of the phone fading into the winter darkness of the garden. I left the question of her redemption for a world I no longer lived in. The ledger was balanced, the work was done, and the house was finally peacefully mine. Looking back at this family story, I realized my greatest flaw wasn't a lack of love, but a lack of boundaries. I spent years building a kingdom for a daughter who only wanted the keys to the vault. Don't be like me. Don't mistake enabling for fatherhood, for you might end up building a fortress of solitude instead of a home. This family story taught me that wealth without wisdom is just a slow-acting poison. I believe the Lord's timing was perfect in exposing the rot, forcing me to choose between a comfortable lie and a painful truth. In the end, this family story isn't about the $48 million I gave away, but the self-respect I finally earned back. This family betrayal left scars that no amount of money could heal. I've learned that a family betrayal is the ultimate test of character, one that I almost failed by being too blind to see the truth. May you never have to endure a family betrayal to understand that love must be earned, not just expected. Thank you for walking this final stretch of the journey with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. How would you have reacted if you faced Victoria's cold manipulation? Your perspective means a lot to me. If this account moved you, please subscribe so we can share more stories of truth and transformation. Just a quick note, while inspired by real-world themes of inheritance and trust, certain parts have been dramatized for a more powerful narrative. If this style doesn't fit your preference, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that might better suit you.